For 6 years that I've been researching Hezekiah Moscow, you know, I love the guy, I really do, but he's a scoundrel.
London, the lion's den. Don't matter if you were raised here or you just got here. You learn to fight. Or this city will swallow you whole.
Bruises, cunning thieves, and bare-knuckle brawls. The Disney Plus show 1,000 Blows gives viewers a ringside seat for the world of Victorian boxing. But how much of what we see on screen is based on actual history? Were the characters of Sugar Goodson, Mary Carr, and Hezekiah Moscow real people? And was there really a gang of female thieves called the 40 Elephants? Well, I spoke to 2 historical consultants on the show to find out.
Thousand Blows is very much created by an amazing team of writers, but it is inspired by real people. So Hezekiah Moscow is played by Malachi Kirby, Francis Lovell plays Alec Monroe, Daniel Mays as Punch Lewis, and Sugar Goodson is played by Stephen Graham. They are all based on real people. The characters in the show are, however, very, very different.
Let's start with the amazingly named Sugar Goodson, played with grizzled intensity in the show by Stephen Graham, and his brother, Treacle Goodson. We know that the real Sugar Goodson would have been about 25 years younger than Stephen Graham at the time that the show is set, and he also only had one working eye, which I think would have been a cool detail to include, but fine.
Yeah, Sugar and Treacle Goodson, so Henry and Tom Goodson. Great names, aren't they? We don't know exactly where they came from. There were 13 Goodson siblings, and their father owned a haulage company. He was a carman. And we think they might have come from the products, perhaps, that they were hauling. So boxes of sugar and boxes of treacle, perhaps. That's one theory anyway.
And there's one infamous incident that the real Sugar Goodson became most famous for. A blasphemous bout, which I think is in keeping with the character's hard man vibe in the show.
In 1882, he had a bare-knuckle fight in a chapel. Well, it's long debated whether it was a bare-knuckle fight. It was prosecuted as such, but they claimed that they wore gloves. This fight in a chapel takes place right in the centre of London and is busted up by police. There were undercover police in the room. So it's a huge press story. Because of the novelty of these scoundrels fighting in a church, there is betting on a communion table. Absolutely shocking.
So, just like in the show, it sounds like the real Sugar Goodson was a pretty hardcore guy who probably would have thought that boxing gloves were just for wimps. When he retired, he became a publican, but that didn't stop him from getting in trouble.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why the Sugar Goodson specifically was chosen for 1,000 Blows beyond the fact that he's got a really cool name. But there are certainly elements of truth behind Stephen Graham's interpretation of him. He was constantly in trouble with the law, usually for prize fighting in the chapel. He was arrested again in 1884 for a prize fight in a barn. He beats up his brother, Treacle, at one point. He is arrested for, I think, sort of drunkenly shouting in the street at one point. So yeah, there's elements of this sort of a bad boy character that definitely come out in Stephen's performance.
Pitted against Sugar Goodson in the ring, we have Hezekiah Moscow. As played by Malachi Kirby in the show, he's fresh off the boat from Jamaica and looking to make his name in the British capital. And once again, the show's creators are drawing on a real person here.
Hezekiah Moscow is really, really interesting. So he never boxed as Hezekiah Moscow. He does in the show. His boxing name was Ching Hook. And it's a bit confusing as to where he got that name from. But in the early days of his boxing career, 1882, he's described as Chinese. Later on, he's described always as black. I cannot really make a call just looking at his photographs, and we have 2 really lovely photographs of him, whether he was in fact mixed heritage, but we do know that there were Chinese people in the Caribbean in the early 1860s when he was born, so there's a good chance he possibly was. In the show, it's written in as having a Chinese grandmother. We know that he arrived in London in about 1881 or 1882. We have little information about why he arrived or where he came from. We know from the 1891 census that he was from the Caribbean. It just says West Indies. We don't know if he was definitely Jamaican. In the show, both him and Francis Lovell's character are Jamaican. He starts bear taming and lion taming at the East London Aquarium, and he starts boxing in 1882 as well. So he had this really interesting double life where he's taming animals as Hezekiah Moscow, boxing as Ching Hook. He isn't what you see in the show as a kind of a champion. He's a very well-regarded lightweight, but he's not a champion.
The real Moscow had about a 10-year career training and boxing across the country, until something quite strange happened.
He marries a woman called Mary, not Mary Carr, which you will see in the show, but a woman called Mary, has a daughter, Eliza, in 1891. And in 1892, he walks out on them both and disappears. And for 6 years that I've been researching Hezekiah Moscow, I love the guy, I really do. But he's a scoundrel. Years and years after his disappearance, Mary and his daughter are writing to the newspapers in the hope of getting the attention of some of the fellow boxers who knew him and finding out what on earth's happened to him. They never find out. Years later, another boxer mentions that they saw Ching Hook, Hezekiah Moscow, in New York working as a dock guard, half-starved and friendless. We don't know if he definitely went to New York, and perhaps that other boxer was mistaken.
And where do the 40 elephants fit in? In this era of tight corsets and stifling gender expectations, there wasn't really an all-female criminal gang, was there? Well, in fact, the 40 elephants were a real gang, but they were just based in Elephant and Castle, hence the name, rather than the East End.
They're very enigmatic. I mean, gosh, but they're absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that makes them so different from male gangs is that they didn't rely so much on violence to get what they wanted. They were very, very canny. I know they were around at least since the 1870s and headed by Mary Carr. But this gang may have been in existence as early as the 18th century. They were very skilled at distraction techniques. They used their gender. They used their being women to their advantage to pull the wool over people's eyes because people don't suspect women.
In the show, we see Mary Carr disguising herself as an aristocratic lady, something that Hallie explained was a real tactic used by Mary and her gang.
She wore a lot of different clothing, and in the 19th century, it's very much based on optics. You hold yourself, you comport yourself like a gentlewoman or a gentleman, you wear the right clothing, you're taken as such. You speak like that, you're taken as such. And so if you can pull that off, you can fool people.
Some of the wild stunts that we see the elephants pulling off on screen might seem too audacious to be true, but these two are grounded in fact.
The elephants would go into department stores and they go into shops and they would have things like false arms, they would have false pockets, and they would ask to see things and then they'd distract people and they'd go right into the pocket. I mean, I kind of have to take my hat off to them because it's so subversive. They would approach like a kind of well-to-do looking man getting on the omnibus and say, "Look, oh dear sir, I don't have any fare," and very well-dressed woman, and he would pay the fare, and then she would get off with him and follow him halfway down into an alley or something like that, and then suddenly she starts screaming that he had tried to rape her, and then some of the other elephants who were waiting in the wings, waiting for this, would come up and go, "Oh, and I've seen you, sir, do this to this woman, and I'm going to attest, and quick, call a constable," and the man's horrified by this, and then Mary Carr will turn around and say, well, all this can go away if you give me £50. And then often, if he didn't do that, she would just grab his watch and run. They would blackmail employers as well, or they would they would use false references to work as domestic servants, and then they would organise the house to be completely cleaned out. Really, the levels of deception that were used were so canny.
So we've established that the 40 Elephants were a real gang run by a real criminal queenpin called Mary Carr. But how much do we actually know about her?
What a fascinating person who used so many different aliases. But also one of the things that makes her even more interesting, and we do depict this, is that she was a life model for Frederick Lord Leighton, who was the president of the Royal Academy at the time and lived in Leighton House, which you can still go and see. And by the way, the production reconstructed Leighton House. They built Leighton House on set, which was so impressive. I can't even tell you. So Mary Carr was Lord Leighton's model, and that really shocked people, shocked society when they found out about that. And there's some suggestion that Leighton's famous picture, Flaming June, that she may have been the model for that, but whether that's true, I don't know. But she had a really, really varied life as well, and she was in and out of prison. And then there's another character that appears, and her name is Alice Diamond, or Annie Diamond, as they called her. Now, she did not appear on the scene until much later, until the 1920s, and she was the second queen of the elephants, as they were known. A decision was made to bring her in much earlier, and when Mary Carr, in real life, towards the end of her rule as the queen of the elephants, was in and out of prison, Alice Diamond made her move to take over.
Right at the start of the decade, 1880, the Home Secretary issues a directive to magistrates to crack down on prize fighting. Prize fighting and boxing sounds like it's going to be the same thing. I mean, the real difference is prize fighting was usually bare fist, and it was done for money. It was illegal. Betting on it was illegal. And then what you see over the decade is absolutely relentless newspaper headlines saying, the revival of prize fighting, yet another prize fight. There is prize fighting happening absolutely everywhere, usually out in some marshes, in a field in Kent or somewhere on the outskirts of London, all over the country. 1 a.m, to try and avoid the attentions of the police. But there is a crackdown on it. They are constantly getting busted by the police.
And alongside the salacious headlines about illegal prize fighting, a more legitimate world of boxing was also on the rise.
You've also got, in around 1880, the formation of the Amateur Boxing Society. In 1885, the formation of the Professional Boxers Society, which was mockingly called, I think, the Battered Bruisers Benevolent Fund in the press. And you have boxing absolutely everywhere. In pretty much every pub, particularly in East London, there is a boxing saloon, a back room, a sort of attached room where there's boxing taking place. There are clubs across the West End and in central London. Boxing's massive.
In the first episode, we see the Goodson brothers duking it out with all comers at the Blue Coat Boy Inn. But was that really a thing? Could you head down to your local boozer to enjoy a few rounds of boxing along with your round of drinks?
The Blue Coat Boy pub, we know that was a real pub. It was run by Punch Lewis, who's a real person, and he's played by Daniel Mays in the show. And the boxing nights were managed by the Goodsons, Sugar and Treacle Goodson. So it's real. What you see in the show, though, is a boxing tournament where 10 different men on the night will pay to enter the ring with Goodson and see if they can beat him. Well, you didn't really get that in 1880s London. You kind of did with wrestling, certainly, and you might have done a little bit with the sort of boxing booths that toured the fairgrounds, but it's really fun to watch. Yeah, it sets the scene really nicely. I had a hand in the costume choices. We see a lot of photos from this period posed in studios of boxers in that typical pose with their hands up, bare-chested, and they'll all be wearing white tights, and that wasn't the case. They were all flashy dresses, purple knickerbockers, black tights with patterns, colourful silk scarves around the waist. It was a lot more colourful, I think, and I think the Thousand Blows has done a really fantastic job of showing that.
Something else the series shows us is a vision of London's East End at this time, which is very diverse. We've got our two boxers from Jamaica, Hezekiah and Alec, and we also have a Chinese landlord, Mr. Lau.
This idea that somehow everybody was white in London or in Britain is just ridiculous. It just simply wasn't the case. The East End was quite diverse. Limehouse, for example, where a lot of the ships came in and out, there was a very big Chinese population there, significant Chinese population. This is a reflection of the empire. And it simply was that way. It's just absurd to suggest that it wasn't diverse.
So how true really is 1,000 Blows to history? And does it matter?
It's always important to remember this is television. So it is not an accurate representation necessarily of what happened. However, I think the wonderful thing about period drama is it is a gateway drug to hardcore history, because a lot of these characters were real people, and there is a lot to be learned about the black experience in Victorian London. There's an enormous amount to be learned about the women's experience, about the Chinese experience, and the books are out there.
So there you have it. When you're watching 1,000 Blows, just bear in mind that although the details may have been switched around a bit, the real history is just as interesting. And if you want to hear my full conversation with Sarah Elizabeth Cox for the History Extra podcast, all about Victorian boxing, then just search for Victorian boxing wherever you get your podcasts. And there's plenty more on Victorian history on this channel and historyextra.com.